So I am Matthew Dickerson, and about 20 years ago, I thought I took what I thought would be a once-in-a-lifetime trip to Bristol Bay with my dad. I didn't know I'd ever go back to Alaska again. My dad and I saved up for about 2 years to take a trip together. My dad at that time was in his 60s. He's now 20 years later in a memory care unit down in Brandon, and I think if I waited even 4 years, he probably wouldn't have made the trip. But I took this once-in-a-lifetime trip that I thought in 2003 to Bristol Bay with my dad. Did a 6-day float trip. And then in 2008, my brother moved to Alaska, went to work for the Alaskan Native Tribal Health Consortium. So he was flying all over Alaska helping Native peoples with their healthcare building projects. And I started going up there the next year, and then a couple of years after that, what actually brought me to Bristol Bay was trying to study and learn and write about a massive heavy metal mine that a Canadian mining company has been trying to put in to the headwaters of the most important salmon water in the world, called the Pebble Mine at some of the headwaters of Bristol Bay. So that started bringing me back to Bristol Bay regularly, and I've been in about 11 times in the last 9 years. Taking 2-week-long trips up to 16 days. I've camped in several places in Bristol Bay, and last year, Alaska State Park named me as artist in residence and assigned me to a state park, the largest state park in the United States, which is one of the important headwaters of Bristol Bay. So that's kind of my background. It turns out that although the initial story that brought me to Bristol Bay was writing about the proposed Pebble Mine, there's been another hydro project proposed, and then climate change is having a significant impact there. So these are some of the stories I've been working on. But what the real story is for me today is abundance and diversity in this drainage. So what I want to do is mostly share photos, tell a few stories prompted by the photos, and give you a sense of this tremendously diverse drainage. It's a tremendously diverse watershed, and why it's the most important and abundant and undeveloped salmon waters in the entire world, and why it's important, but also give it a sense of its beauty. So just to kind of give you a place, here's a little bit of a video of where I'm going to bring you here. This, of course, is Alaska. The largest state in the U.S., and as Alaskans like to joke to the expense of Texans, Alaska may be the largest state, but if you cut Alaska in half, Texas would no longer be the second largest state. Texas would become the third largest state, behind the two halves of Alaska. And some people have said if you cut Alaska in thirds at low tide, then Texas would be number 4, but I don't think that's actually accurate. I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration. But there's Alaska. The Bristol Bay drainage is the easternmost part of that Chukchi Sea. If you look at the Alaska Peninsula, it's the easternmost part of the sea that tucks into the Alaska Peninsula here. So really here is kind of the critical part of this Bristol Bay. This is the most famous part. The cities include King Salmon, Naknek, and Dillingham. And all those other places that you see on the map are really just villages of 68 to 80 people. So that's Bristol Bay. And 50% of the world's wild sockeye harvest is from Bristol Bay. And 30% of all the world's salmon harvested in the wild come from Bristol Bay. So that's an absolutely stunning amount. If you think of salmon harvest from all over the world, that 30% of that, or over 29%, like 30% plus or minus 0.1%, comes from this drainage, from this watershed. A couple of the places we'll visit are Lake Clark National Park and Preserve, which we'll zoom in here. It's sort of in the upper northeast portion of Bristol Bay. Lake Clark National Park and Preserve, there is 4 million acres. So by perspective, that's the size of Connecticut. Not quite as big as Vermont, which is about a little over 7 million acres, but Lake Clark National Park and Preserve is the size of Connecticut. It's named after this lake, which is Lake Clark. But there's almost any of the lakes here would dwarf pretty much any lake in Vermont other than Lake Champlain. So Lake Clark, if you count Little Lake Clark, is a little over 50 miles. Most of this are mountains in the Alaska Range. So there are 3 active volcanoes running down the Alaska Peninsula, all over 10,000 feet. So Lake Clark National Park, almost all of which is in the Bristol Bay drainage. A little bit of the eastern shore of the park actually flows east into Cook Inlet. And if you've forgotten, Anchorage is right about here. And this is the Kenai Peninsula. This is the Cook Inlet. And this is the Lake Clark National Park. So again, almost all of it is in the Bristol Bay drainage. It flows west and south down into Bristol Bay. Whoops. What did I just type? There we go. And if we continue on south from there, we get down into the next big national park, which is Katmai National Park and Preserve. And Katmai National Park and Preserve is also 4 million acres. So you put just those 2 national parks together, and you get something significantly bigger than Vermont. Part of my story is actually going to take place in the most famous part of Katmai National Park and Preserve, which is the Brooks River and the Brooks Range, which is the one place in the world where you have the iconic bears standing on top of waterfalls, catching salmon out of the air as they jump up. And everybody thinks that happens all over Alaska, and it happens really in one place. And we'll come back to that. So that's the very short Brooks River, and I actually got to go there 2 times this year for the first time in my life, because my wife was with me, and that's where she really wanted to go. And that's the iconic Brooks Falls, where if any of you follow the Fat Bear Week and the Fat Bear Contest they have every year, that's where it happens. And this year I got to go there twice with my wife, and I actually got to fish there, and my story will start in Brooks Falls. It's very different from the rest of Alaska, because all the other places we're going to are remote, and I can go all day without seeing anybody. And here, you can have 200 people from all over the world flying in for the day and lining up on those platforms to watch the bears. This story will also eventually take us to one more place, which is further west in the Bristol Bay drainage, and that is to Wood-Tikchik State Park, and in particular to where I was artist in residence and this little 2-mile-long river called the Egg-Sucking River. And I got to stay at the very head of that river in the ranger cabin at the Egg-Sucking River campground. So that right there was my home for about 5 days when I was working on this book. Again, this is probably the most important salmon river in the world, the Wood River right here. And that little cabin up there on the right was where I was staying. You can see it in the photo. So that's a little bit of a geographic sense of where I was and where these stories will take place. And so let me jump now very quickly to just give you a sense of the trip in to Bristol Bay. The flight into Bristol Bay from Anchorage flies through Lake Clark Pass, which is 2 absolute massive ice fields that stretch for hundreds of miles, and it is glacier after glacier after glacier after glacier. Just everywhere you look, it's hanging glaciers and rivers of glacier like you see here just coming down. It is an absolutely breathtaking 1-hour flight on a little plane in from Anchorage to Bristol Bay. Every time I fly, the lighting is different, the scenery is different, the mountains look different, but it's just glacier after glacier, including these seracs, which the pilot told me are 60 to 80 feet tall. They look like little toys out of the airplane window. But these little spires are 60 to 80 feet tall in there. These glaciers turn out to be really important because it is the melting of glaciers all summer long which provide the cold water that the fish need to keep their lakes and their rivers cold and well oxygenated, and which determine when the spawning of the salmon are. So, you know, all of these little glaciers have these big, long rivers flowing off of them. And eventually they make their way down into Lake Clark, and from there into Lake Iliamna, and from there down into the Nushagak River and into Bristol Bay. And again, if you look back there, it's just ice field. It's just little arms of the ice field sticking out in glaciers everywhere you look. Absolutely stunning landscape. 7,000 to 7,000 foot peaks up to several peaks over 10,000 feet. And all sorts of just different glaciers, all with their different looks. And finally, we arrive here on Lake Clark. This is a little village of Port Allsworth, which has been my base of operations in every trip to Bristol Bay except for 2. And that is the view out the front of my little cabin at the farm lodge, looking up at, they call these the mountains with holes because they have these little circular spherical dents in them that look like giants have dropped bowling balls into them from the skies. That is directly the view out of my cabin this September, just 6 weeks ago. That's what I'd wake up to in the morning, looking out over Lake Clark National Park at the mountains and a little bay off Lake Clark. And that plane, that little beaver, is one of the original planes that this lodge had when it opened 50 years ago. They sold it, and then it came up for sale in Florida again 2 years ago, and they bought it back. They say probably none of the parts, not a single part in it is the original part. Everything's been rebuilt, but it's the same plane. And that's the view looking a little bit eastward. If I stood where I was just looking at the camera and I just turned my camera 45 degrees eastward, that's the view. And then again, this looking back over those mountains that we just flew in, and those are the mountains that hold all that snow that melts all summer long, that keeps that water cold, that makes it possible for those salmon to live there. So that's just a quick introduction of kind of the place I've gone. And I want to jump, though, to what really got me telling these stories in the first place. So this little scene here is a river in Katmai National Park. Can't quite hear the sound of the water over that. But this is only about 90 miles upriver from the ocean, which is not far at all for salmon to travel. There's salmon that will travel 1,200 miles to spawn. But it's about 1,200 feet in elevation. So over 90 miles, those salmon have climbed up 1,200 feet. At 1,200 feet there, it is above what we would think of as a tree line. It's just open tundra. It is a harsh, windy climate. And this is the last waterfall that these salmon have to go over. A lot of them have begun to spawn before they even reach this waterfall. They're pooled up in this pool here below the waterfalls. You can even look down on the water and see how thick they are. If you look closely here, all of this red is just the whole pool. If you looked at it from the sky, it would look like someone dumped paint into the water. It's so full of sockeye salmon. The ones that are still remaining will get up that falls, and over the next 2 miles, they will finish their spawning run. Salmon spawn once and die, so they lay their eggs and die. And a number of salmon, if you think how many you just saw and realize that's one small river out of hundreds and hundreds of different rivers, each with hundreds of headwaters, and you get a sense of how much salmon and how diverse and how important the watershed is. The whole landscape is dependent on salmon which bring in hundreds of millions of pounds of nutrients into the soil every year. The salmon spawn, they die. Most of them come up on shore, a lot of them get eaten, and their nutrients, what are called OBNs, ocean-borne nutrients, will then get spread out over the landscape. So a significant amount of everything that grows there is growing from the nutrients brought into the river by salmon. They used to think over 90% of the nitrogen in the soil even came from salmon, but now research has suggested that in some places a lot of it's coming from alder trees also, which are nitrogen fixing. So alder trees will pull nitrogen out of the air and dump it in the soil, but in most places they don't even have nitrogen, and the nitrogen is coming up from the ocean in the form of salmon. So the whole ecosystem is dependent on the ocean. But the opposite is true. All of those salmon in the ocean, which feed everything else, like they're a keystone species to the whole ocean ecosystem. They're feeding all the marine mammals, the seals, the sea lions, the whales, the sharks. They're dependent on these rivers. So you damage these rivers, you destroy the rivers, and you destroy the whole ocean ecosystem, like we've seen happen in Maine. Except in Maine, it was killing the alewives. A little bit of a sense of that. This was one of my first experiences way back quite a while ago in the same river. This is about 100 yards downstream. And if you look out at this, you will see all along here living salmon working their way up the river. There. The water is so shallow and they're so tall that they can't even get underwater. And dead salmon everywhere. I think there were 6 bears here when we arrived. But here's here's another little scene for you. That bear was not a good hunter. But it was the dominant bear, so it had the best spot. So if you watch, this bear is like an old ADHD bear. It can never decide which one. It'll start chasing one and then see another one out of the corner of its eyes and turn around and start chasing a different one. Oh, wait, there's another one. And it'll turn around and start chasing a different one. And so all the while that this big dominant bear is out there, there's a slightly smaller bear who wants to hunt here. And he's watching and waiting for his turn. And that bear, I mean, you see all the salmon in the water. Finally, this bear just gets impatient. It comes down. It's a little scrawnier. It wants to fish where the other one is. And finally, when the other one turns its back, that smaller one will run down. And I'm not kidding. This one has been there for like 20 minutes unable to catch a salmon. The younger one will jump in and in about 15 seconds grabs a salmon. And then the big bully comes and chases it away and grabs it from him. There's the dynamic we just watch play over and over again, okay? And unfortunately, I cut my video right there because about 5 seconds later, that other bear chases the young one, bullies it, grabs the salmon away from it, right? And climbs up the hill. So what the biologists tell me is there's so much food in the river right now that the bears don't even bother eating the salmon flesh. If they catch a female, they will strip it open and just eat the eggs. And if it's a male, they will just eat the brains. They will eat the head and the brains, and they will ignore the rest of the salmon. There's so much there. And the bears have about 3 months to get really, really fat for the winter. And they can't afford to eat salmon. Salmon is not dense enough in its caloric intake and nutrients that the bear will skip the salmon and just rip the eggs out as long as they're that dense in the water. Oh, and it's not only the rotting salmon that are carrying the nutrients. Everywhere you walk on the tundra, it's mounds of landmines, big massive piles of bear droppings. Droppings is the wrong word, like bear shit everywhere in massive piles, spreading those nutrients out. So that's what brought me here. This is kind of why I'm here, is this picture of tremendous both fragility and a really, really harsh landscape. And at the same time, tremendous abundance and diversity. It's just hard to fathom. So let's jump briefly to Brooks Falls, to that one famous camp where people come from all over the world, where the bears are stacked up sometimes 20 at a time within 100 yards of each other. The flight in took us over a 1924 volcanic eruption called the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. And it buried this valley in 70 to 90 feet deep of volcanic ash. So, picture a valley the size of Addison County, 90 feet deep in ash, with just a mountain on each side and nothing in the middle but volcanic ash. That's the sort of wild, harsh landscape. That canyon down there was carved by a river in ash, 90 feet deep. And there you can see the one side of the valley and just an immediate sharp contrast between the green and all of the ash that was dumped there. You also see the wing of the airplane I'm flying in. Sometimes I'd work hard to get a picture without the airplane, and then other times I'd think, that's part of the story. I'm going to intentionally capture that little airplane wing. And then this is Brooks Falls, that famous, iconic one spot in Alaska where you can get as many as 20 bears here, because there's even more, as much as there is every place else, there's even more salmon here. And they're easy to catch. And every year at Katmai National Park, there's a fat bear contest to see the bear that gains the most weight over the course of the year. And the winners are usually about 1,100 pounds. They go from about 600 to 1,100 pounds in about 2 months of eating. There's one you can't see that I'll show you in a minute. You can only see its ears right here. And it's in a deep pool that they call the office. And this one just catches salmon by snorkeling. It just sticks its head under the water for about a minute at a time and looks for the salmon. This one is 747. That won the Fat Bear contest 2 years ago. This one was the best fisher that day. That one's Gully. And that's the one that was actually successfully snagging them out of the air. Well, my wife watched it, caught 3, leaping in the air, and its just concentration is perfect. And the moment one leaps, it's reaching over to snag it. And then the 4th one that was there that day, there's Gully. That was Gully's pose. You could sit and take a picture, and 99 out of 100 pictures were going to look like that. And every once in a while, it would yawn a little bit, get tired. But then the other bear, and there's 747, and you can see a little bit that one in the distance. And then there's that bear. That's the one that was right next to us. We were up on a little bit of a viewing platform, and that bear is about 15 yards away. And that one is called Chunk. They all have numbers because the biologists keep track of them, but the ones that are the most popular and have been coming a long time, they named them too. And this one's Chunk, and it was one of the finalists this year in the Fat Bear contest. It came in 2nd place. It was just sitting on a rock and not fishing at all, because what would happen is anytime another bear caught a fish, it was, being the dominant bear, it would just go try to bully them. So Gully's on the top of the falls, and every time Gully caught a fish, Chunk would run up to the falls, and Gully would be trying to eat it as fast as possible before Chunk could steal it from him. It is a harsh environment there. And yes, I got to fish here. So they closed the area within 100 yards of the falls. But both times when I went with my wife, I got in about an hour and a half or 2 hours of fishing. And by 2 hours of fishing, what I meant is about 20 minutes of fishing and about an hour and 10 minutes of getting away from bears coming up the river. So again, the bears are there's so much food that they don't care about people. They essentially ignore people. You have to be careful of them. You don't want to upset them because they do have a hard life. like they got to fatten up. You don't want them to lose even an hour of feeding. But more or less they ignore you. The 800-pound bear is not worried about the person. The 800-pound bear is worried about the 1,000-pound bear. So all of their attention is on each other, and they will just give the casual glances to humans. But if you're out fishing and you catch one, they will try to rip your fish off the line. So you have to fight it and bring it in as fast as possible. So it was both one of the most thrilling places I've ever fished and also one of the most frustrating. Because I got into about a 29-inch salmon. I finally spotted it right against the shore, and I'm moving in, and I'm just getting ready to cast. And I'm so excited because this is like a fish of a lifetime. And all of a sudden, one of the big bears, I think it was 747, steps out of the woods right next to where I want to fish and about 18 yards away from me. So you turn around and you don't run, but you turn around and you move steadily and quickly away from the 1,000-pound bear because it has first rights to the fishing spots. There's a little bit of a close-up. I like to say objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. So it is really dramatic to be that close to these bears. So that's a really popular place. You're not alone in the wilderness. But for the rest of the pictures, all the other places I go, you are in these remote, wild landscapes where you may go all day without seeing anybody. So I want to give you a little bit of a glimpse of some of those landscapes and then some of the bears and fish at some other spots. And again, tell a little bit of stories. By the way, pause at any time if you have questions. I don't really care if I get through all my photos. So if anyone has questions, feel free to pause. This is a sort of a glimpse of the type of landscape. It is canyons and waterfalls and lakes, and even in August and even early September, there's snow on the ground. It just does not get that warm at 1,200, 1,400 feet of elevation out there. My pilot friend who lives there every once in a while when he wants a little family trip and he doesn't have to fly guest, he will land at one of these places and they will climb down and he'll show his pictures on social media of his family under one of these waterfalls. But there's again, this is my favorite river anywhere in Alaska to fish. I don't tell people what it is. I try to keep my guides secret. A little bit of the sense of the wildness of that landscape. There are more bears in Bristol Bay than people here. The density of bears is higher than the density of people. Again, the sense of the terrain, where I'm taking pictures of fish and taking pictures of bear, and then every time I can getting into the river and fishing. It is more breathtaking than any place I've been on Earth. Just wild. On an August day, it can be 75 degrees and you can be sweating, or it can be 50 degrees, with a cold wind blowing through your ear, and you're in August and you've got a wool hat on and fleece gloves. That was the year my son and daughter-in-law came with me, so I had a photographer that could get pictures of me down in the river fishing. And that whole river is just lined with sockeye salmon. Oh, and by the way, I should point out, I'm not fishing for the salmon. I'm not interested in the salmon. So I said that the salmon are the heart of this ecosystem, meaning everything is feeding on the salmon directly or indirectly. Either they're eating the salmon or their eggs, or they're plants, and all their nutrients are coming from the bear poop or the rotting salmon. Even underwater, the ecosystem is centered on it. And the two fish I'm there to fish for are rainbow trout and a species of char known as Dolly Varden trout. And I'll come back to some pictures of these and tell you a little more about Dolly Varden, which is the fish I've fallen in love with. But what I'm doing when I'm fishing is I am looking for spawning sockeye salmon, and then I go behind where they're spawning, because some percentage of their eggs will drift free. They won't settle into the gravel. And the eggs that drift free are a free meal for all the fish living downriver. So the rainbow trout and the Dolly Varden char and the Arctic char and the lake trout, all those are 4 species all in this river. They just sit behind the spawning salmon, and they barely even have to move. They just sit and gobble up the eggs. And by the end of August and early September, they're the fattest fish you've ever seen. They're just absolutely rippling with muscle because they don't have to work. They're just sitting in the current and gobbling eggs. And you catch them, and eggs are popping out of their mouths. They have been eating so much. Beginning late August and early September, they start shifting from eating eggs because the salmon are mostly done spawning. And the salmon are beginning to rot, and their flesh is floating downstream. And they're beginning to eat rotting salmon flesh. And so here are a bunch of flies I've tied to imitate rotting salmon flesh. Early in the year, their flesh is bright pink. And then later in the year, they start to get paler. And so I tie a variety of colors from bright pink to dull pink to mostly white to imitate the rotting salmon flesh. And you throw a chunk of this and you just let it float down the river, and this massive trout will come up and gobble these flies up. And I can come and take a look at these later. So the whole ecosystem, right, is just eating salmon. And the salmon that rot and don't get eaten and don't get float up on shore, they will drift all the way out to the ocean. And in late fall, halibut will move in from the deep ocean to within 6 miles of the coast to eat the rotting salmon flesh. So even out in the ocean, it's the rotting salmon flesh that's providing all this food. The tundra is covered with wild blueberries. The first time I saw them, I thought someone must have been picking them and spilled them because they're all laying on the ground. But the plants don't grow up. It's just too windy. There's very regularly 20-mile-an-hour winds blowing across this tundra because there's no, I would say there's no trees. There's no visible trees. So the wind is blowing across the tundra, so the blueberry bushes grow horizontally along the ground. But there are also birch trees, and some of the birch trees grow horizontally along the ground, and a 30-year-old birch tree is about this long and maybe about this high off the ground, and it just bends like this. It's because they have a few weeks every year to grow. The conditions are so harsh, not much water in the winter, a lot of wind in the summer. So like a 30-year birch tree might look like my little bent pinky finger. Which again, when you look at that and you realize how abundant the life is, and you think of the salmon bringing all that nutrients up, it's even more spectacular. This was my camping spot the one time I camped in the tundra. We had a 20-hour period where the wind just kicked in at like 25 and 30-mile-an-hour winds, and it was pouring rain, and we couldn't leave the tent. You will also notice an electric fence around the tent. That's why there's an electric fence around the tent. Multiple times while we were there, a brown bear came by to check us out. They didn't care too much because there's so much salmon in the river, but they would come by and check us out. In fact, right when we arrived, you don't eat near the tent. So we would carry our food. We carried our food in food bucket in bear-proof barrels, a couple hundred yards away from the tent. And 30 minutes after we arrived, we had eaten lunch, and we're just finishing up, and a bear comes by. We ran back into the electric fence, and the bear knocked over our bear barrels a couple times, and then just wandered on down to the river and started catching salmon. So this is that river. That's that earlier scene, the video I showed you. That's about 30 seconds later. Now the bear that caught the salmon is like running away. The big bully's taking it away from him. The big bully went up on the cliff to eat his salmon, and the younger one then was free to catch another one on his own. And that was kind of him just looking back down the river and giving a little bit of a warning growl to the other one, like, this is mine, don't come up here. And again, it is an adrenaline rush to be out fishing here around them, because they're such powerful creatures. They're aware of you, but they don't really care about you. They care about each other, and they will just check you out from time to time. And our guide went over all the rules. You don't ever leave anything in the ground because they get curious. So you always have everything with you, and you stay together. And he said the reason you're staying together is not because they will attack you otherwise. Is that what happens is, if a 600-pound bear sees an 800-pound bear coming, the 600-pound bear wants to take off running. And you want to make sure that he only has one group of you to avoid rather than 4 or 5 individuals. Just a few more of my bear pictures. Like they're just eating the salmon everywhere. Look at the river. I don't know if you can see how many salmon are down the river. This is the same river 7 miles downstream. We had 21 bears that day with my son and daughter-in-law. 21 bears, including 3 sows with triplets. That was the closest that one came to us. He just walked right by our gravel bar. And just again, that was just the briefest look he gives at you. Just kind of turns, checks you out, gives you about a 10-second look right in the eye, and then he turns and walks on. And the cutest moment was one of these, with the sow came by, and it's only 10 yards off our gravel bar, maybe 20 yards away from us. And that was the first point I got nervous. Like I said, okay, Glenn, like all these other bears are okay, but we're with a sow and cubs. Aren't they really protective? Shouldn't we be afraid of a sow and a cub? And Glenn says the opposite. He said, male bears, so a female brown bear will nurse its young for up to 3 years, typically 3 years, sometimes only 2, but about 3 years. And they're not estrus. They're not ready to mate while they're nursing. So a brown bear will eat not only other males' cubs, but a male will eat even its own cubs in order to get the female's estrus again. So when there are humans around, the females will actually intentionally bring their cubs closer to the fishermen because the big males don't want to come near there. The big males are more skittish around people. They're very bold around other bears, but skittish around people. So the females will bring their cubs in close to people because they feel safer there. So these are the 3 little cubs leaning on the log while their mom's fishing and trying to catch them. And it's just a scene that we just kept playing out multiple times over the course of the day. This one's a little bit worth watching on a hot day. They just took a break from eating. It was clear from watching it that one of them, the one on the left, really wanted to play, and the other 2 siblings didn't. And the other siblings kept trying to walk away. They're trying to nap. The mom's napping. There's the mom. But there's one playful one that just does not want to nap and just keeps wrestling with its friends. It's really clearly play for them, and at the same time, it's preparation for life. Because their social dynamics in 2 to 3 years will actually be doing that not to play, but in order for the right to hunt or the right to mate. And so there's incredible playfulness there, but it's also a productive playfulness that's teaching them. Bears are not the only wildlife there. We saw 6 to 7 years ago and 10 and 15 years ago, the caribou were dense there. My first trip, we flew over one caribou herd that was 2 miles long, probably 5,000 caribou. The Nushagat caribou herd has collapsed in the last 10 years. They've almost all disappeared. Biologists don't know exactly all the reasons, but one strong conjecture is that climate change is playing a big role. That it is killing some of the plants, and it's also making it possible for trees and alders to grow where they haven't grown before. Like the lichen, which is what they eat, is getting overtaken now by other things. The climate was too harsh for them, too cold for them 30 years ago. And now all these other plants are overtaking the lichen, and the caribou herd has collapsed. I haven't seen a caribou in 3 years up there, and we used to see them all the time. The moose are moving in, though. So the climate is becoming very unhospitable to the caribou, but much more hospitable to moose, which isn't necessarily great for a lot of things because wolves are more successful at hunting caribou than they are at hunting moose. Moose are a little bit too big and strong, typically, for the wolves to want to hunt. Of course, those are a very common sight there. The bald eagles. That's probably my favorite bald eagle picture I've ever taken. And again, just kind of the idea of the fishing, what it looks like outstanding in the river. That's the highest river. That river is American Creek, and that's 1,600 feet in elevation. And that was in late September that year. So just a few pictures of some fish, and then I'll end with just a couple more, couple more stories. No signal. Let's try this again. I don't know why. There we go. So I just want to show you a few of the fish. That is a sockeye salmon. That's a spawning male sockeye. You can tell it's a male with two ways. One is it's really tall. It's got a big hump. It's not torpedo-shaped. And the other is the males get these big hooked jaws called kypes. And the biologists tell me that females will always spawn or mate with the tallest, reddest male they can find. So being really tall and really red is a genetic advantage for passing on. They don't know why the females pick those, why the females think that being really tall and really red, and by tall I don't mean long or big, I mean a big hump on the back, is somehow advantageous. I don't normally fish for sockeye, but sometimes a 7 or 8 pound sockeye will hit my fly, and they're kind of fun to land. And so I try to land 1 or 2 each trip and then release them. That's a friend of mine from Colorado who met me up there. This may look like a sockeye salmon in the color, but this is actually a silver salmon, sometimes called a coho. Most people think of it as the best game salmon. It's the best fighters. Most salmon don't really eat once they're in the river because they're going to die, but silver salmon will continue to eat. If you notice a sockeye, they have a green head. They turn red, but their heads turn green. The silver salmon, their heads don't turn green, and they're a little more streamlined. And this was a day when I got probably 15 8 to 12 pound silver salmon fishing in one day. Another species, these are rainbow trout. Rainbow trout are related to salmon. They are almost certainly evolved in the Pacific Ocean. So you can find these species, they're trans-Pacific. You can find them in Eastern Asia, Russia, and you can find them in Western North America. They were not widely spread across North America when Europeans settled or conquered, colonized North America. But they're very easy to reproduce in a hatchery. And so they're the most commonly stocked species of trout in the world. And it's kind of sad because they're now thrown in rivers all over the world to the detriment of native fish because people want to catch rainbow trout. This, however, is where they actually are native. This is one of the few places where this is the dominant native species. And I don't know if you can see, if you look where my hand is, just how absolutely fat, stuffed that belly is from a whole summer of eating salmon eggs. That's another native species to Alaska. That is the northernmost cold water species in the world. That's an Arctic char. It is the same genus as Vermont's brook trout. So it's not actually a trout. It's, even though some char are called trout, like a brook trout, it's actually not a trout, it's a char. So true trout have black spots on a light background. And you can always tell a char because a char will have light spots on a darker background. And they're actually Arctic char in New England when Europeans first came to North America. There were 2 lakes in New England that still had a remnant population of Arctic char, and about 7 lakes in Maine, and 2 or 3 in New Hampshire, including Sunapee. They're extirpated from Vermont, they're extirpated from New Hampshire, and there's just a couple remnant populations left in Maine. And it was stocking of non-native species that killed them. So if you've ever heard of blueback trout in Maine, blueback trout are actually Arctic char. Another rainbow trout, I just like the picture because it just shows that they're just too big for my net up there. And rippling with fat. That's an Arctic grayling. Absolutely beautiful, beautiful fish. When you first see them, they kind of look like a drab olive color. But they have these gorgeous sails in the back, which make them really hard-fighting fish. And when you look closely, they're really very colorful. They have black and sometimes dark blue spots, and then these almost fluorescent purple shimmering scales on the side. And there's my favorite. That is a Dolly Varden char. Dolly Varden is a character in the Charles Dickens novel Barnaby Rudge. And the first Europeans who saw Dolly Varden char thought, oh my goodness, they're so colorful. They look like the flamboyant dresses of this Charles Dickens character, Dolly Varden. So they named them Dolly Varden char. They're probably the most recent native immigrants to North America. They most likely came from Japan or Asia 40,000 years ago on the same land bridge that many people think brought humans to North America and brown bears to North America. Except they were in the water and the bears and the humans were on land, but they followed the land bridge. It's a very diverse species. So there are populations of Dolly Varden that live in tiny mountain streams. There's populations that live in big rivers. There are populations that live in lakes. There's populations that live in the Arctic and will move back and forth all summer to winter between Russia and North America. They will cross the ocean from North American rivers to Russian rivers. So they're really diverse, genetically diverse, and also really beautiful. They look like a 9-year-old girl got into her mom's lipstick. And one other species worth pointing out is world-class northern pike fishing. That's a 4-foot-long northern pike, also caught in a fly. Okay, that's enough of the, yeah. That's the fish of my life. I was happy with that one. So that gives you a little taste of what the fish are. Back to the story, just a couple more stories and I'll wrap it up. This is Lake Contra Tribuna. It is the lake 3 miles up the river, 3 miles up the mountain from Port Allsworth where I was staying. In 2019, my son and daughter-in-law and I and one friend of ours from Starksboro took a 5-day canoe trip across the length of this lake, 14 miles and back, camped their way down and back and fished. And it's worth pointing out because this river is above that waterfalls and salmon can't get up the waterfalls. So it's really interesting, from that waterfalls down is an entirely different ecosystem than from the waterfalls up. From the waterfalls down, you have the salmon-dominated system where sockeye salmon will come in and spawn there, bring all their nutrients up, everything's eating them, and from there up, it's different species of fish. And they actually eat insects, they eat other fish. They're not totally dependent on salmon eggs. And just one morning, these showed up, and it just gave me a sense of the abundance and diversity of this watershed and Contra Tribuna. I just point this out because it's just a different, it's in the Bristol Bay drainage, but it's one of those places above a waterfall, one of the few places that salmon would go hundreds and hundreds of miles in every direction, never actually get to this spot. But there's 2 more stories to tell about this. I was marveling at the sunset one night as I'm camping my way across the lake with my brother. And then the next morning, there's the sunset. And then the next morning, the sunrise over our tents. Beautiful, beautiful camping spot. But as I was marveling at that picture, the scent coming into me was a scent of smoke. In that summer, 2019, everywhere we went in Alaska were massive wildfires. The number of wildfires in Alaska is growing rapidly every year. The number of lightning strikes reported in Alaska as growing rapidly every year. So we had 3 places I wanted to go that summer. One was evacuated because of wildfires. One we were able to get to, but there was a massive burnout. And here, we're about 40 miles downwind of a really big wildfire that had been burning for weeks. So it's one of the impacts of climate change. They're now getting temperatures over 100 in the Arctic. Temperatures over 90 in a lot of places in Alaska. And this summer, the snow, it didn't rain. They're getting 80 plus and 90 plus degree temperatures. They're getting wildfires, and the snow disappeared. So all of a sudden in early August, the lake level just starts dropping. You could see it dropping day by day as we're canoeing across the lake and back, because there's no more snow melt to fill it. Like normally the snow melt lasts all summer long, the glacier melt lasts all summer long. All of a sudden there's no more snow melting, and the lake just begins to drop. The water temperature, every time I've been up there, I've caught Arctic char, which want water temperatures, are you okay? They want water temperatures below 40 degrees. And the water temperature at the surface was 50. So it's the only time I've never seen like almost no Arctic char, because it was just too warm. So climate change is one of the big things. It's also one of the reasons why the diversity of this watershed is so important as a refugia, as climate change continues to impact places. That as one of the fisheries biologists I talked to said, there's a lot of stressors. And a lot of fish can adapt to an occasional stressor, like an invasive species is a stressor. Deforestation would be a stressor. Pollution would be a stressor. All these things add stress to a system. Climate change is a massive stressor on fish. And so if you can protect them from other stressors, from development, from polluted waters, from deforestation, then they're going to be much more resilient to climate change. So that was one of the stories. I went up to this area to write about this I think absolutely horrible heavy metal mine that would be 100 times the footprint of the largest current mine in Alaska, an open pit mine. They planned to build a heavy metal tailings pond, lake, behind a 2-mile, 600-foot long dam made out of earth. So that would have been the second highest earth dam in the United States, holding back toxic heavy metal tailings above the world's most important salmon water. The EPA put a firm no on it in 2015, and then a new administration came into the White House in 2016. That new administration fired all the heads of the EPA and brought in oil industry executives to be at the head of the EPA. And they reversed the decision and opened it up to open that mine up again. So fortunately what's happened, and it just this year, finally, there's been a major blow, which is several native corporations, so that the native people's legal corporations that kind of control the land, and one big conservation organization managed to raise $20 million to buy an easement, not on the land where the mine would be, because that's not controlled, that's owned by the state, but the only place where they could put in a haul road to carry all the ore out to the ocean. So even if they could put in the mine, there would be no good way, cost-effective way to get the ore out. But it's been a big battle. So I went to write about that mine, but it turns out, climate change is one of them. My final stories were about the Gulapak River. I'll just show you a couple pictures. That was the cabin where I got to spend 5 days learning about and writing about salmon. That was the view out my window. It's interesting because this is one of the few places in Alaska where there was an abundance of both phenomenal insect food. The caddisfly hatch in the river was so thick, even though they don't bite me, I couldn't walk out with my mouth open, or I would be eating them as much as the fish were. But also, salmon coming up the river. So you see a mother with 2 cubs across the river. We watched her catch that fish. There's a meadow above us. It was covered with, it was an acidic meadow. So the whole meadow is like this acidic wetland where these acid-loving plants grow. And I'd never heard of these before. They're called cloudberries. And they're circumpolar. And you can also find them in the Canadian Maritimes, in Labrador and Newfoundland. And there they call them bake apples. We picked a handful with my nephew who was there with me. He brought it back and made a pie. But I wanted to show you this video, and then I'll end just telling you one more short story. Watch the water here. See that? The whole time we're there, anytime I looked out on the water, it was just, you could hear them, salmon just rolling up the river. And if you look around, if you're looking in the right place at the right time, you just keep seeing these heads roll, and you hear them, and you hear the splashes. And when you wade out in the river, it's like a highway. You saw that one there? Moving underneath you. And here's just one river, the most important salmon river in the country, one of the most densely populated salmon rivers flowing into Bristol Bay. And so I talked to the head of the salmon program. And here's the kind of the last story as I talked to him about it, what makes Bristol Bay so important and so worth protecting. So he said, scientists know of over 60 different genetic variations among sockeye salmon. 60 different genetic traits for fitness, for how well they all survive. So we think of the species as very homogeneous. But he said if you look at different rivers around Bristol Bay, there are 60 different genetic adaptations to very, very local waters. What diseases they're resistant to, how red they are. So the females always want to pick the reddest salmon, but in water that are really cloudy with glacial silt, the salmon actually can't see each other. They can only smell each other. And so the sockeye in those rivers don't bother turning red. There's a metabolic cost to the salmon to turn red. It actually costs them energy to change their skin to red. They don't bother changing to red in these cloudy rivers because the females can't see them. It doesn't gain them anything. The size of the eggs differs. So it's advantageous to have a larger egg. There's more nutrients in the egg. It's heavier, will sink down better. But in rivers with really fine gravel, the big eggs won't get into the fine gravel. So the sockeye that go back, because over 90% of all sockeye return to the same rivers where they came from. There's a little bit of drift. They might go 4 to 5 miles one way or another. But over 90% of all salmon return to their natal streams. And the sockeye with big eggs, they're not successful in spawning in the tall gravel, in the fine gravel, because the eggs don't get down. And even how tall they are is a genetic adaptation. And the biologist said, actually, in the really shallow streams, the tall salmon don't do well. They get in the shallow streams, and they're so tall they tip over. I thought that's ridiculous. That would be so funny to see. I'm not kidding. A week after that, I'm in this little stream, and there are 2 sockeye salmon spawning in this tiny little stream. And I noticed these 2, there's a male and a female, are really streamlined. They're small. 75 yards downstream, there's a really wide, shallow area in this stream. And there's one of those big, tall, humpbacked sockeye, and he can't get up the stream. When I walked down to look at him, I spooked him. He tried to shoot up the water, and he was so tall, it got partway up the gravel and tipped over and couldn't make it any further and just kind of flopped back down. So why this is important is, as a biologist, Daniel Schindler was telling me, is he said, what you have are all these different streams, some high gradient, some low gradient, some warmer, some colder, some larger, some smaller, some with fine gravel, some with big gravel. And sockeye micro-adapted to each of these. And so there's two reasons why that diversity, a lot of reasons why the diversity is important, but two big reasons. One, any particular weather year, particularly with extreme weather, can make one river worse. Like you have a very small stream or a warm stream, and a hot, dry year is going to make that stream really bad for salmon spawning. But it will turn a big, colder river into a better conditions. A really wet year will take one of those big high gradient rivers, just make it too swift and deep for the salmon. But that really wet, cold year will take one of the smaller streams and make it better. And so what they see is when you get a bust year in one place in that watershed, you get a boom year someplace else. And so over the whole watershed, it evens out. They're seeing increasing, it's like one places in the world where over the past 10 years they're actually seeing increasing salmon harvests at the same time that even more of them, the escapement remains high. That's the number of salmon that actually escape the fishing nets to move upriver. And so it's actually the salmon harvest and the salmon spawning has actually been getting better in this here. And they say a lot of that is just how much protected diversity there is. The second reason, and this is where I'll end, is that diversity also means the timing of the salmon spawn. When salmon spawn is also a genetic fitness trait. Because if they spawn they have to spawn at just the right time when the water temperature is just right. And so they're genetically sort of adapted to one particular river. So what happens is the very first scene I showed you in the very first pictures when I'm flying over that pass, it turns out that river is the latest salmon spawning river in all of the Bristol Bay. And they don't come up into that river and spawn until late October or even November. Whereas this river that I just showed you, they're starting into it in July. And so what happens is there's so much food in the river that the limitation on big predators like bears isn't how much you can eat in a day. It's how many days they have to get fat. And typically in one river, the salmon spawning is only about 2 weeks long. So if all the salmon spawn at the same time, the bears would only have 2 weeks to eat. But because of all the diversity in the watershed, the spawning goes from late July all the way through early November. And the big predators, as well as birds, as well as bears, will travel hundreds and hundreds of miles to move from one salmon spawning place to another. Even the rainbow trout and the Dolly Varden trout will go hundreds of miles chasing the spawning salmon. So I've actually talked about 10 minutes longer than I wanted to. But that was my last story. I thought this would be a nice picture to end on. Little sunset on the Igulapak River. If anyone has questions, if anyone wants to look at my flies, these are my rotting salmon flies. And of course, the title of the talk, my favorite fly, are my egg-sucking leeches. Yeah, they're works. My flies aren't works of art, but a lot of people's flies are works of art. Those are all imitations of either salmon eggs or a worm eating a salmon egg or a leech eating a salmon egg. That pink one is actually, I just didn't have room on the other side. That's actually a rotting salmon flesh fly. Yeah, they're tied with all sorts of different ingredients. Any questions or comments for me?
How much does your book cost?
How much what?
Does your book cost?
I can sell them for $20. I could probably sell them for $15. I don't actually need them. I don't mind. But they're also in the Bristol book and the Vermont Book Shop. So I'm also happy to have people not get them at all, or get them there, or take one out of the library. You have one. They have a copy here, yeah. So you can save your money.
What time of the year do you travel to Alaska when you go?
I have been in Bristol Bay in July, August, September, and once in October. My favorite time to go is mid to late August or early September, past the peak of the tourist season. The sockeye spawning has reached its peak. There's still sockeye in the river spawning, but the trout that are eating are beginning to shift from eggs to rotting flesh, and it's beautiful at that time of year. The fish that I'm fishing for, the rainbow trout and the Dolly Varden char and the Arctic char, they are so big and fat at that time of year. The foliage is gorgeous. You're starting in by early September to see the dusting of snow on the peaks. So if I could pick any time, I would like to go in late August and early September. The big disadvantage of going there is the weather gets pretty unpredictable. Up until about middle of August, you can get pretty nice weather, 75-degree days, 55-degree nights. But when I go in late August and September, I'm going to count on warm days, 55, maybe 60, 40 degrees in the morning by even the first week of September. Snow in the mountains, windier, rainier. I'm more likely to have a trip canceled because the pilots where I go are really, really safe. They've never had any accidents. They've never had any problems. I asked Glenn. Glenn is the pilot who I did most of my work with, and it's his photographs. And all these were my photographs except one. Glenn Allsworth is the Bush pilot who grew up in, actually the town of Port Allsworth, where Lake Clark National Park is named after his grandfather. His name's Glenn Allsworth. Port Allsworth was named after his grandfather, who was a legendary aviator, Babe Allsworth. His wife is Athabascan native, so Glenn is 1/4 native. I asked him one day, do you ever get nervous flying? And he said, I've got 5 kids at home. My plan every day is come home to my wife and my 5 kids. So I've been out flying with them when all of a sudden he's just taken the plane down on the tundra, landed there. We've gotten out and we spent an hour picking blueberries because the pass he wanted to go through had fog in it. He's not going to take any risks. We're going to wait till the fog burns. We don't take risks here. Yeah. And almost, most times I've gone the last 2 years, we've had plan changes. Yeah, we were going to go here. We're not going to go there today. The weather's bad. So if you really aren't there to, if you really want to go see bears, but you wanted a little nicer weather, I think kind of any time from mid-July through mid-August, you're going to get good weather. And once the sockeye are in the rivers, the bear are going to begin to concentrate, and you're going to be able to go to a bear. No. You can hunt bears, but not at this time of year. I think the bear hunting season is September, and it's very restricted who can do it. There are a lot of moose hunters. You can't hunt in the national park unless you're native, unless you're local people. There's legal subsistence hunting for moose. But otherwise, the moose hunting has to be on state land or someplace else. Yeah. My nephew goes caribou hunting. My nephew, who still lives in Anchorage, goes caribou hunting in Alaska also. Yeah.
You mentioned the lightning strikes.
Yeah.
Is it the lightning strike itself that's unusual, or the fact that the ground is
It's the number of lightning strikes, because they're actually sensitive instruments that pick up these lightning strikes. And so there's 50 to 75% more lightning strikes in it per day than there were. So 1 is the number of lightning strikes, and then 2, because the permafrost is melting, it dries out really quickly. So a lot of the fires are not out actually in forest fires. In the Kenai Peninsula, it's massive forest fires. And part of that is invasive insects have killed a lot of the trees. There's a lot of dead trees, which makes the fires worse. So Kenai Peninsula, it's forest fires. But out in the tundra, it's actually the dry grasses and the lichen, because when the permafrost melts, there's nothing to hold the water up. So the plants, the water just soaks in and disappears. And they don't get a lot of rain anyway. Like some of the Arctic is actually desert in terms of number of inches of rain. It's fewer than 12 inches of rain a year. The coastal Alaska rains. Ketchikan, Alaska is 210 inches of rain a year. But the tundra is a lot less rain, and it just dries out. So the lightning hits it, and those fires will go down underground. They'll burn down into the layers of moss and peat, and they're really hard to get out.
The area where the volcano was.
Yeah.
I know it's arid there, right? So
Actually, that's more coastal Alaska, so that area is actually very well forested.
But that area where
where it was.
Yeah. I was
Yeah,
But I was still surprised, like after all this time, there
yeah,
wasn't
100 years.
anything
Yes.
on.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at where the glaciers are receding, so one of the places I've gone to Exit Glacier and just walked up, and if you go to where the glacier was just 40 years ago, it is a forest now. Within 40 years, it's been colonized by trees. But the ash is, I think, very highly alkaline, among other things, and it's so deep that there's just absolutely no way roots can get past that ash.
And nothing, no little microscopic life has adapted to.
There might be some microscopic life there, but it might be, centuries before that can actually build up enough biomatter. Usually the first thing that colonizes after the glaciers is a grass called dryas, D-R-Y-A-S. And then that's followed by some low shrubs. And then typically the first trees that come in are the alders because they don't need as much nutrients in the soil. They are nitrogen fixing. So, yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful selection.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.